So good afternoon and happy new year, everyone. My name is Jade Stewart, Director of the National Academy of Inventors, and I have the distinct pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion. The NAI is proud to present this insightful panel on financing your discovery as part of our continued mission to provide practical and valuable resources to academic inventors and members. The question of how to get the right support for your discovery is something that each inventor must consider and handle carefully in order to protect their intellectual property and successfully bring their work to market. I'm so pleased to be joined today by three exceptional individuals, each here to share their unique perspectives with you. So let me start by introducing today's panelists. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Robert Duncan, a professor of physics and an inventor. He is the President's Distinguished Chair in Physics at Texas Tech University. He was the Gordon and Betty Moore Distinguished Scholar at Caltech. And Rob, who I'll commonly refer to as Rob today, is a fellow and board member of the NAI, a fellow of the American Physical Society, and serves on the Scientific Advisory Board of the United States Air Force. He is also a former Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Missouri and a former Senior Vice President for Research at Texas Tech University. Next, I would like to introduce you to Sarayu Srinivasan, who is an international venture capitalist, technology executive, and entrepreneur. Sarayu recently completed 2 details as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow, where she worked on the Lab to Market initiative, better engaging federally funded innovation with venture capital at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, as well as setting up public-private partnerships to help modernize government at the United States Office of Management and Budget. She's also the founder, CEO of consumer shipping marketplace, Cargo, at leadership roles at many startups and large companies, including Intel and Pepsi, and she holds visiting scholar and teaching appointments at universities worldwide. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Robert Williams III, who is the Johnson & Johnson Centennial Chair of Pharmaceutics and the Division Head of Pharmaceutics at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Texas at Austin. Bill's research interests include the development of novel drug delivery systems and novel practical engineering technologies. He is the co-founder of many companies and is a fellow of the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists, the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering, and the National Academy of Inventors. So welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. So the title of today's webinar is Financing Your Discoveries. This is a very broad subject with many facets that we could discuss for hours. But for the sake of time, which we only have an hour today, we will focus on the following topics: choosing the right backer for your type of discovery and what questions to ask before selecting that funder, the types of investors, preparing for the pitch, what are the do's and don'ts, and who should run your business, and how your institution plays a role in the discovery of funding. So we'll allocate 15 minutes. We'll pause around 3:45 to allow the audience to answer or ask any questions that you have, or even ideas you'd like to pitch to the panel. So please submit them throughout the meeting chat or the Q&A feature on Zoom. So I want to start today's panel by asking the question, why is this topic so important to you? Sarayu?
Why is the topic so important to me? So as somebody that has spent my career in technology and a big chunk of it as a venture capitalist, it's important because I want to do my job right. And so I want to invest in great companies that are deploying, I'm a technology investor, so deploying impactful, interesting, and sometimes fun technologies and change the world that way. So that's why this topic is important. I want to make sure the companies that want to raise funding are able to access that funding.
Wonderful, thank you. Rob, how about you go next?
Yes, I think that's a very important point, Sarah, you made. From the perspective of an academic, a physicist, a scientist, often in academia, we have really focused traditionally in the past on publishing and graduating our students and that sort of thing. That's very, very important. but it's so much better a return to society if we take that translational step of teeing up our discoveries so that it can really drive the knowledge-based economy. And so I guess I'm really passionate about this because in the process of taking that extra effort to do the translation, to do the initial company formation, to get things off the ground and to get basic initial financing, usually there's a cascade of sales later to bring the invention to the level where it can be the most significant benefit to society. That process is a much greater return on the public investment into everything we do in academia. And it's also a way of expanding employment, improving the quality of employment as we bring new technologies to the forefront. So I would say that's why I am really passionate about this topic. I mean, the process of financing your discoveries, first of all, going that extra step to do the translation and secure the patents, and then find a way to move them into the marketplace, creates huge value to our knowledge-based economy and expands employment and really just creates opportunity, which is outstanding.
Thank you, Rob. I couldn't agree more. Bill, how about you? Why is this so important?
Thanks, Jade. And to add on to what the other panelists have said, is I have focused on, when I started my career in academia, I noticed that there was actually lots of inventors around the University of Texas at Austin. And many of them were quite unhappy with the reception that they thought their intellectual property received. And so I really thought about this for a couple of years. And so the strategy that I've had and that I teach students and scholars that study in my lab is focus on problems. Because in order to go convince Dr. Srinivasan that she needs to fund the company and fund the IP is really based on solving a problem. And so that's what my entire career has been about, and very passionate about strategically choosing what to study, what to patent, based on knowledge of whatever area you're in. So that is my background to complement the two other panelists.
Great. And as you can see, we have very diverse perspectives and experiences on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to your responses for the remainder of the questions. So now let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, so to speak. The sudden arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected many facets of the global economy. From your perspectives and respective backgrounds, how has the uncertainty introduced by the COVID-19 crises changed the nature of the way funders operate? Or is the industry immune to the type of uncertainty that the pandemic has created? Go in reverse order now. Bill, how about you?
Yeah, so in my area of research, drug delivery, pharmaceutical technology, COVID has been an eye-opener. And fortunately, my research directly benefited both therapeutics and vaccines that are being studied now and developed and clinically tested for COVID. And during this time, one of the companies that spun out of intellectual property from my laboratory raised lots of funding, went public just before the pandemic, but raised money as a public company shortly after the pandemic, and was really able to leverage intellectual property and, again, focus on the problem at hand, which was COVID-19. And I think it has, at least from the pharma and biologics world, it has created just such great science that, we'll look back one day and it's unfortunate, and I'm not justifying COVID-19 by any way, but we have used it to really drive science and applications of biologics like the mRNA vaccines that, really have been in the literature for 10 years or so, and now they're actually being administered to patients.
Right, you bring up a very interesting point that, again, pandemics, crises, while, in itself is unwarranted and unforeseen, it does allow for our inventors to really step up, as well as those who've already developed technologies to help rectify the problems at hand. So thank you, one, for your incredible work and research on this. And yeah, I agree. The funding that's out there now, especially for the pharma and biomedical sectors, there is still definitely a lot of funding there. Now, Rob, how about you in your area?
I very much agree with what Bill said. And I think that one of the interesting things to note is that historically, when the economy's gone out under the yellow, we have seen some of the biggest surges in innovation. And that's partially because the economy is slowing down. So really creative people have more time on their hands, okay? And they can think about things that they might not have pursued when they were in the red hot economy and were under big, delivery demand schedules and that sort of thing. For example, Hewlett and Packard during the Great Depression started working out of Professor Hewlett's garage in Palo Alto around Stanford. And they started working with this upstart Missourian who had just moved to Orange County and started an amusement park called Disneyland, Walt Disney. And again, that started during the Great Depression. Hewlett and Packard's first deliverable was a audio effects generator for Walt Disney. Around the same time, a few other people figured out you could put a radio in a car, and Motorola was born. So it seems as though sometimes the silver lining to a time like this is the opportunity for really creative people to kind of break out of their box a little bit and think about what could be if they went, further in directions that they haven't had time to explore. And I think we've seen that with the emergence of a number of really innovative new companies that have come out over the last year, some of which have gone public, many of them are not, but are nonetheless creating a big impact on our economy today. One thing I'd say real fast too, I'm a physicist, but most of my inventions are in the area of minimally invasive cryosurgery and that sort of thing. And so I've always been interested about applying physical sciences to advancing medicine and healthcare. And in like February, March, one of my Chinese-born postdocs, who's now a naturalized US citizen, read the medical literature from Wuhan, and we realized that this was a very different type of deep lung infection, one that really required a different type of ventilator than that which was normally used. And so we brass boarded that. We put together a prototype for that and have a provisional patent on it now. And remarkably, that's the fastest provisional patent I've ever seen licensed. It licensed within about 2.5 weeks from invention. So again, this is a great time for the people with the true inventive spirit to focus on, again, innovations that are really relevant to the task at hand. And no bigger, the thing, like when they asked Neil Armstrong what he would do if he was stranded on the moon with 3 minutes of oxygen left, how he'd spend the last 3 minutes of his life. He said, naturally, working on the engine, right? I think that's a lot of what people in innovation and technology are doing these days to try to address the COVID concerns.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Now, Sarayu, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Very much agree with what both of the other panelists said. I think from a venture capital perspective, initially in the spring, I think there was a chilling effect because people didn't understand what was happening and what was going on. And so I certainly saw personally things like hiring slowing down in VC firms and people sort of waiting to take stock. But the death of venture capital has been greatly exaggerated, I'm happy to report. And things seem to be not only going per usual, but as both of the panelists have referred to, there's been all sorts of new opportunities coming up. If you look at the public markets, you've seen there's not a week that you don't see a company going public. You are also seeing in venture capitalist portfolios, the vast majority of those companies are actually doing quite well. I think the statistic is something like 10% of the portfolio companies have been hard hit. And I think that you have so many interesting and new opportunities in so many different areas. Healthcare, telehealth clearly is an obvious one. Communications. There are all sorts of things. People are looking for different ways to entertain themselves. Online commerce. So you're seeing sort of an explosion in innovation. Tying it back also to Bob's comment, and as people are figuring out sort of what the new reality is, but I think for VCs, they're sitting on a lot of dry gunpowder, and what they're seeing is a lot of opportunity out in the marketplace. And I think the pace has not slowed down the way that we fear that it might back in spring.
Great. Thank you for those insightful points. So moving to our next question, as we saw from the poll earlier, we have a variety of audience members at different stages in their career, that they are all motivated to learn how they can finance their discoveries given the participation in the webinar today. So based on your personal experience and expertise, who are these funders? What are the steps one can take and the questions one can ask to identify the right type of funder for them? So Rob, how about we start with you?
Okay, yes, I think it's an excellent question. And the nature of who the best person or organization will be to help fund your discovery and innovation will depend very much on the nature of your innovation and your discovery. Is your discovery kind of incremental in an existing market to where it improves something that is already pretty well established? And if that's the case, then the approach may be looking at investments that might be strategic alliances with the companies really in that right now. It might be a situation where you would go and get some initial companies started based upon STTR or SBIR funding, especially if it's come through federal investment, the basic research that led to the innovation. There are a number of great resources like NSF I-Corps and its structure of a national faculty around different hubs and regional networks to help inventors really kind of determine what that best approach will be and where to address it. Now, if the invention or discovery is truly very disruptive, meaning it's really going to change things fundamentally, and there might not be that kind of background infrastructure, then there's a great opportunity to speak with venture capitalists. And just in my own experience, we came up with a new type of intravascular cryosurgery for heart arrhythmias. And it was a multidisciplinary team. We went to talk to an excellent venture capitalist in the San Francisco area and in Cubic Venture Capitals. And at any rate, it was really interesting because the advice we got was, well, yes, we would fund this as a venture capitalist, but they said, since the market cap's low, about $100 million or so, not even like a tenth of a billion, that's a small market cap as venture capitalists are concerned. They said the strategic alliances with the major companies that are currently in the market, because your transformational technology really is. So whoever gets it is going to have a big advantage over this emerging smaller market cap, is really a better way to go. And so I thought Milton Chang's advice, president of Cubic Venture Capital, was extremely helpful. And we ended up not being funded by him, but going and talking to the CEOs and CTOs of the companies, like about 5 worldwide, that were really involved in this fairly low market cap space at the time. It's since grown dramatically. But I think that, again, the number one thing to answer that question of where is the most appropriate funding for your invention or your discovery depends so much on the nature of what market your discovery or invention can address. And so talking with people with a lot of prior experience in this sort of thing early on can be really great to kind of pitch how you go about finding ways to fund your discovery.
You dropped a lot of great gems there. Thank you, Rob. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in addition to Rob, I completely agree with it's the nature of the invention. What I would add there is, being an academic, there's a lot of privileges that an academic inventor has, and there's also a lot of stress that we have because we don't know what Dr. Srinivasan knows. specifically regarding how to run a company, how to get money, how to take it public. And what I would say is, and what I've done is I have worked extensively with our Office of Technology Commercialization at the University of Texas at Austin. And these folks they're professional. They've all got industry experience. They've been there, done that, not as an inventor, but as helping facilitate raising money. And so in the last venture, the companies that I've been involved with starting that are based on intellectual property out of my laboratory, what I've done is worked with them. I've secured funding from a company that comes with a license agreement. That company then we work with, we meaning me as an inventor, other co-inventors, and our Office of Technology Commercialization. And we secure the company, the funding, and we get industry veterans in that can really guide the direction of the company on areas that I just don't know, and frankly would rather focus on the science part and making sure that's useful. So I would just add to what Rob says, consider, getting industry funding, a patent license agreement. That is another avenue that's very viable and pretty low risk for us as inventors and faculty, because we're not actually putting our own money in play, so to speak.
Thank you, Bill. You brought up a great point about seeking a licensing agreement. And I know as an academic, you may have resources available to you at your institution. Can you just share a little bit more about what that process looked like for you specifically?
Yes, so I have this de-risk strategy that I teach to students, and it's, you have your idea, you have data, you file intellectual property, and then you publish in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. That's your marketing piece to get people interested, teach, the funding people what you're doing. So once you do all that, you are working with your Office of Technology Commercialization to help you then market that what in my case is a portfolio of patents that are all, towards a synergistic objective, scientific objective. And then they help you really go out and market to the venture capitalists, to companies, to the pharmaceutical industry. Depends on exactly what, as Rob said, what the invention is. But that's generally the steps. And it's very straightforward. Our university, it's like a machine, which is really good for new faculty coming in. We have a process that's not magic. It's very straightforward to follow, and really depends on the invention itself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Now, Sarayu, I know you're coming from the perspective of the funder. So what questions were important to you? Or just in general, what steps do you think inventors who are interested in financing their discoveries take when approaching a funder?
Sure. I first of all want to thank Bill for calling me doctor. I am not a doctor. You've made my mother very, very happy. She's not on this call, but I will be sure to tell her. So in terms of, you asked what we're looking for, or?
Yeah, so what questions should one ask a funder, or what steps should one take to seek the funding?
Yeah. I think both the other panelists beautifully captured sort of from the government academic side. There's, ICOR, SETR, SBIR available, but what if you're looking at private financing? So the good news is, again, there is a huge world out there. It's not just venture capitalists, there's angel investors, there's crowdfunding today, so you can go around that. There's plenty of sources of money. Even private equity firms, sovereign wealth funds, family offices are coming into that venture asset class, which is generally more early to growth stage types of entrepreneurs. In terms of when you're trying to choose somebody, sort of alluding a little bit to what Bob was saying, I think it's important to do your homework. So it depends on what you have and what kind of money you want to raise. And I think too often academic inventors will sort of just send out pitch decks or try to speak to whoever, whatever names they've heard. And that's not a very good strategy to raise capital. Knowing who you're speaking to, doing a little bit of research of if the areas are sort of aligned with your research or the areas that you're working on, and then reaching out, going to, I mean, today we can't get out and go to networking events, but certainly online, there are plenty of seminars like this where there are people that you can reach out to get a little bit more information. Making sure that you're in sort of places where you can connect with funders, and there's plenty of ways to do that, and plenty of resources. The NVCA is another great way to find out about who's out there. But there are just so many angel lists, so many different resources out there on the internet that don't even require you leaving your house in order to learn more about sort of the funder and what they're looking for, and then reach out to them that way. So I would say, I think the biggest mistake I see sort of academic folks making is that they sort of don't do the research ahead of time in terms of who they're speaking to, and then they get very disappointed and think, oh, these people aren't interested. You might be speaking to the wrong people.
I'm glad you said that. That's a very important point, to do the preliminary research for one, but also recognizing who the right person is to speak to regarding that funding opportunity. And I can definitely relate in a sense of doing your homework when it comes to seeking capital in general, for especially with working with NAI, but also for the other entrepreneurial activities outside of that. So now that we've identified the different facets of fundraising to help offset the costs of early stage innovation and invention, how do we sell the idea to these funders? What are some tips on delivering the best pitch? And I'll go to you, Bill, to start, since you have a lot of experience in this area and have been successful at a number of startups with your innovations.
Thanks, Jade. So to me, the best pitch is, and I rely on what Sarayu said, it's making sure your technology, your invention is matched with who you're talking to. And that comes from a lot of due diligence, as she explained. And then secondly, I have found the best pitch is, it is 100% based on science. And the science, because that's what they're there to hear about. And the science is grounded in peer-reviewed papers. And so the theme is don't rush what you're doing. Don't rush it to get in front of a potential funder. Make sure it's mature enough, and that it's, through a peer-reviewed article, at least it's been peer-reviewed by 3 or 4 of your scientific peers, which is very, very valuable. And I have found that the funders that I've talked to many, really respect, and the questions you get are just a much deeper, wanting to understand the science and not necessarily questioning whether it's real or not, because their assumption is if it's peer reviewed, that's a major step.
That's a really great point. So not only about the patent, what protects the intellectual property or the invention, but also considering publication as another way to validate the scientific nature and value of the product itself. So that's a really great tip. I'll go back to Sarayu now. Again, from your perspective, what are some do's and don'ts to the pitch for our audience today?
Sure. And I'd say from a slightly different perspective, since I look at sort of a broader set of types of investments, we generally want shorter pitches. And I think that there is something that is probably not known in scientific and academic community, which is venture capitalists love to hear stories. They want to hear a good story. Tell me a good story. So the science is important, but I also think sometimes the narrative is something that gets people excited. So you'll often see people running in to do bad deals because they're so excited about the pitch and the product. And but in general, in my world, we want to see something that is fairly short that we can get the idea of what the problem that it's solving is and what your solution is. And that solution also includes who the team is, what the opportunity is, what the technology or product that's solving that is, and kind of that you've thought about sort of what the next few steps are. Nobody's expecting you to have a 20-page financial section in your business plan. All of those things are going to change, and they're probably not going to be what you thought they were going to be when you wrote them out to begin with, but just that you've thought about those sort of concerns. I also think that this is something that we don't talk about in venture, but I find with a lot of academic and scientific inventors, there's sort of this view of the venture capitalist as kind of the curly mustache and the cigar sitting on a top of money, just waiting to do you in and tell you that your invention is horrible. And it's really not like that. If you can change your perspective a little bit and understand that most investors want to do the deal. They want to do a great deal. And also that their end goal may be a little bit different from taking government funding. The government is very generous, can give money, doesn't have sort of it has an endless supply of time and money and people to put on a problem. That's not true with me. I will be fired for doing the wrong deal. So I want to find the right deal to do. I also have a time horizon. That doesn't mean that we can't hold for longer than 3 to 5 years, but the truth is that I'm looking for something that I can see what the end game is, which is to have a financial return. It doesn't mean that I don't want to have a great impact in the world or cure cancer. Or all of those things may be true, but at the end of the day, I'm really looking to see what the return on that is going to be. So if the inventor can sort of think a little bit about, before approaching the venture capitalist, that, okay, this person needs to see an exit, hopefully in their lifetime. The shorter, the better. How can I frame my invention or what our product to kind of show that pathway? And that sort of helps me kind of make a case internally and also figure out, is this something that we can really back? So thinking of the venture capitalist, I think, as more of, are we aligned and a partner, I think is a very important perspective to have, versus in thinking of them as an adversary that I think Shark Tank and shows like that have done a great disservice, actually. We want to do the deal if it's a good deal, but help us see why that deal is good.
You brought up some really great points, Sarayu, and I think the main takeaway that I at least took is that, one, have the story and really sell the idea and address the need or the gap that it's trying to fill. And then address the return on investment. What does an exit strategy look like? What can the venture capitalist or the angel investor receive in return for the investment that they're making?
Can I just interrupt just quickly? And I don't want to, I'm not saying come up with a financial plan. What I'm saying is, if this is a product, show me that 100 million people are going to use it or 300 million people are going to use it. I don't need to see like year by year what your revenue and your expensive, like nobody, that's all going to change. Nobody's expecting that really, but show me that there's a market, and show me this is something that we can sell that's going to cure cancer, or that's going to cure COVID, or that I'm going to sell 1 billion of, in the first 3 years. So it's more that sort of thinking.
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you for addressing that point too. Rob, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I really appreciate Bill and Sarayu's comments. I mean, I think they really lay it out very clearly. What I would say is, to Bill's point, especially if it's really transformational, what you're proposing, or new science, new applications, then I completely agree. Having peer-reviewed, high-impact journal articles behind your approach, showing other possible presentations at major events that really show that the credibility that this is a very real thing is critically important. Then I'd say that going to venture capital, or going to any potential investor, but especially those in the private sector, is showing again that path to a transformational change that could be very profitable in short order. The venture capitalists will know far more than we do in academia about how to accomplish that. So it's not trying to kind of jump in and take a 5% stab into their space, but rather showing that you're aware of the leverage that this discovery can have in terms of really transforming the market. The only thing I'd add is that be eminently reasonable, okay? I have seen too many brilliant inventors trip over their frontal lobes and fall flat on their face and kind of leave a situation that could have been far more profitable with a lot of money on the table that's never going to really translate into true value to society. And the reason is that often they can't get out of their own way. As Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Missouri, we saw Zagrid and antacid become a blockbuster. We saw Organovo go commercial, go public on the New York Stock Exchange. And we saw Beyond Meat go public on the NASDAQ. And again, all three of those were based upon eminently reasonable inventors who could convey not only the significance of their investment, but show that they understood the vast complexity of bringing something to that very large national and international scale. And they were able to convey confidence to, well, Kleiner Perkins in the case of Beyond Meat and to others. They were able to convey that they would be a valuable, humble asset that could make this happen all the way down the line. Big demands by the inventor of like, I'll never be diluted beyond 51% or something like that is like saying, I'm sorry, I wasted your time. You know, I mean, the effort that it takes to make a really significant contribution to society in the commercial marketplace will require the inventor to really have that sort of an eminently reasonable approach to see it through to completion in that regard.
Thank you, Rob. No, that's a great points that you mentioned. And being as you mentioned Beyond Meat, while the scientists behind the brand are still with University of Missouri, the CEO today is Ethan Brown. And so that brings me to my next question is, you know, obviously we have now the tools to successfully pitch the idea, but let's talk about who should run the business. So for example, we've heard that one of the biggest mistakes when Inventive faculty members think that they can lead finance and operate their company in their spare time while continuing their faculty responsibilities. So we all have one thing in common, and that's time, right? So while it may seem, you know, plausible that you can wear multiple hats and juggle multiple appointments, we do hear that that is often sometimes a mistake when it comes to the inventor and, you know, obviously running the business once it goes to market. So I want to hear from the panelists on their thoughts on this topic in particular. So Sarayu, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm sorry. Will you quickly repeat the question? I literally had it on the
Yeah, no worries. Is who should run the business?
Yeah.
So when considering your team.
So I think that will sort itself out pretty quickly when you take private capital. If you are not the person that's going to be running the business, I think there are very few circumstances I've ever seen where somebody that was unqualified to the business, if it's a great business, ends up staying. Part of what you should be viewing outside capital coming in is that they're bringing other skill sets along with it. Part of that is assessing whether the management capability is there, helping you augment that, or if you need to get, you know, training. I'm being very granular here, but so I think that is a piece which is something that will sort itself out when you get with private capital. And in some cases, the inventor maybe needs to be a strategic, you know, somebody that's in charge of strategy or thinking about sort of the future or the visionary behind the company. And I mean, certainly you have lots of precedent for that, right? If you look at Google, I mean, the inventors of Google ended up stepping back and taking, you know, more of a strategic role about the direction of the company. Day-to-day operations were taken over by, in some cases, a professional manager, and in other cases, somebody that had come up through the company. So I think that is something that's going to be expected, and take it as a sign of success if you're at the point where somebody's saying, hey, we need to bring somebody else on to help you. Or so I think that sort of stuff. These are sort of some of the things I think that Bob was talking about that we're worrying about too much, like, oh, what do they take my, don't worry about it. You know, the goal should be that we all are sort of winning as we go along, and venture capitalists are your partners in this journey. And in terms of, you know, like losing sleep at night about whether you're going to run I think those things you get in your own way. And so I do believe that those things sort of sort themselves out in the wash as you go along.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are, I started out about 30 years ago taking a second mortgage on my home to fund a company with a colleague. And that lasted about 10 years, and we sold the company to a public company. We did fine, but we could have done a lot better if we'd have had two more savvy business people running that company. Fast forward to 2 years ago, company was spun out of my lab, TFF Pharmaceuticals. We found actually a former colleague, but he's a 30-year veteran, had run numerous J&J companies, Rumpelink Rohr companies, or Aventis. We enticed him to come and run this company. He has taken it public on the NASDAQ in October 2019. We've been successful running, raising additional capital. I, as an inventor, I don't want to be a consultant. I want to be hands off, but I am involved strategically, helping them understand the technology, talking to customers and potential customers or sub-licensees of the technology. And that's the way to do it. I've also been able to then focus on non-dilutive funding for the company, which also benefits the University of Texas at Austin. We file for, STTRs, SBIRs, and that all benefits my laboratory. It benefits, researchers in my laboratory. So my strong advice is, as Rob said, don't be an inventor who can't get out of your own way. Let other people who know what they're doing step in and help you. What you have to make sure about is they are 100% committed to doing it.
Great, thank you, Bill. Now, Rob, I know we're right at the 15-minute mark before we close the session, but I wanted to kind of switch gears a bit to not only talk about who should run the business, but how perhaps the institution in which you belong could support the venture itself.
Oh, very much so. So as a former vice chancellor for research, former senior VP for research, really, I think your research office and your research commercialization office, to Bill's point earlier in the webinar, can be very, very helpful in that regard. And in a sense, it's kind of a guided self-discovery. I mean, we are conditioned in academia to be very focused and to do an excellent job in terms of analytical research and to be data-driven. That data drive can really help in the translational research to really de-risk. So that's all wonderful. But, we're kind of in that sort of environment, and we have excelled in that environment. The chance that mid-career we're going to switch and be a CEO and excel in that environment is a very, very risky undertaking. I sleep pretty well, but two of my sleepless nights, one was when we started the company to pursue our minimally invasive cryosurgery, and we had 7-8 employees in the initial company. And this is typical. The inventor is very involved in the initial company that later will sell to something that will do the $100 million scale or even more clinical trials and that sort of thing. That's how we progressed. But in that early phase, when you have 7 or 8 people and their livelihood depends on you, and you have to make payroll, okay? Yeah. So that led to some sleepless nights for me, and I usually sleep pretty well. But if you're going to be the sort of manager CEO type, you have to be able to really manage in that environment very well. The other sleepless night was when we did our first human patient, and we were going to have our cryogenic ablation technology inside a beating human heart. And even though we'd done everything, we'd gotten everywhere we needed to be, we were convinced of the fail-safe nature of this thing. Nonetheless, if the technology failed that day, it would kill somebody, So again, I think that it's a very important thing to say that in your role as the chief technologist, the chief scientist, or the consultant to the company to provide that service, you can provide huge opportunity. Just to kind of drive it home, I think that Wozniak clearly would not have been a good CEO for Apple, but he prospered greatly in Apple. And it's great that Jobs was there to be the CEO. So I think a lot of it comes down to just your realistic, natural self-assessment of your strengths versus the strengths of others who can really take it to the next level. And I'd say in like 99% of the cases, the scientific inventor is very rarely the person with those same skill sets that'll make an excellent CEO. Not impossible, but not likely. And so again, as Bill said, get yourself out of your own way. Let this natural environment and team you can build be led in each aspect by the person who's best to lead that aspect of it.
Yeah, thank you for saying it in that way too, because I think really it is taking a look at yourself and doing an assessment of what are your key strengths, what can you really bring to the company should you take it to market, and recognizing that will help you be successful. And I think it will also resonate with you and the venture capitalists in that you can clearly identify what each person's role on the team is and why they're in that role. And it can speak to the experience, the strengths, et cetera, of the individual. But I think, thank you, Rob, for sharing that, and Bill as well. So we do have a couple of questions already queued in the chat. But again, I wanted to remind you all on the audience that if you do have questions for the panelists, please either use the chat function or the Q&A feature. But I want to just first open this to anyone who wants to address this question. And this is from Weston Waldo. So how open are venture capitalists to provide a letter of support to new companies working to receive the first phases of a SBIR STTR grant? Who someone can volunteer to address this question?
Sarayu, you're a venture capitalist. You're probably the best one.
Agreed.
It looks like we may have lost Sarayu.
Either that or she's compiling.
Let me, while she's rejoining, from my experience, and I've done numerous SBIR, STTR grants with companies that have spun out of my lab. The companies and their public companies, and even before the one went public, it had raised money from private investors. And it was never an issue for us to obtain letters of support for the SBIR, STTR grants. And those were successful. Again, the companies, from my experience, they realized, it's non-dilutive funding to advance certain aspects of the research that the company's doing. And they make total sense and is why they're there.
Great, thank you, Bill. Sarayu, I don't know if you're back on camera, but the question was how open are venture capitalists to provide a letter of support to new companies working to receive the first phases of SBIR and STTR grants?
So honestly, I've actually never seen that, but that doesn't mean it. But again, I didn't work with companies that are so early in academia or government. But I think I just heard Bill say that is something that happens quite often. And it doesn't seem like it would be such a stretch if it was something that was interesting and I'd love to see. And I think especially now also, where there are so many reasons for venture capitalists to come in earlier and kind of help support the ecosystem, because they're really kind of sowing they're watering their own garden by doing this. So I don't see why not.
Great, yes, thank you. And I think, just ask the question. And I think Bill too said it best, that it doesn't dilute the funds in a sense. So it is a way to continue to expand on the technology without infringing on the initial investments that a VC or angel investor or anyone else may have already provided. So now our next question, first I want to say thank you for sharing your wisdom with all of us. Nadia, or Dr. Boutaoui, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, I apologize. She is a geneticist and exec MBA in healthcare. And she is also an innovator working on organ on a chip technology called nanoNARS, using nasal cells for preclinical testing. And her question, which I think is a really great one, is when do you know you are ready to start a company? Well, and, Rob, if you want to take a...
Sure. I mean, I would say you're ready to start a company when you can clearly articulate or define a market, okay? And kind of scope that market somewhat initially. Realize patents cannot, you cannot patent laws of nature, okay? So scientific publication should not be seen as either or with patenting, because a patent leads to something that gives market exclusion, and therefore the value of a patent depends on how well you can clearly articulate the market. So I think that it makes best sense to start the company when you can clearly articulate that market. It's interesting. I mean, conceptually, you don't have to lay it out. To Sarayu's point, it doesn't have to be a detailed, numerically exact business plan, but rather a conceptual understanding of where it can really transform society in the free market. So that, I'd say, is when it's the best time to start. Now, it's interesting to note that you can naturally see something as the inventor often that is of amazing potential. But it's so early on, others will not see it, okay? So that's an issue for timing as well. And I think that it's interesting that I think the 2019 Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to a scientist at the University of Missouri who developed, again, these libraries for phage interactions that really have had a huge impact in the life sciences, and now have created, a platform for the markets for many, many different companies. But when George Smith saw that back in 1984, he was the only one, and his patent was declined. And again, he's not bitter about that at all, but he kind of understands, again, that timing issue of a good time to start a company is when you can clearly articulate a market and you can have enough of a critical mass of people that see the opportunity along with you to help validate that. So it's easier to get the patents, it's easier to get the engagement in the commercial marketplace.
No, those are great points. Thank you, Rob. Did anyone else want to add to that question of when do you know you're ready to start a company?
Yeah, I would add one point that I often think about is, you have to make sure that your intellectual property actually can support a company, and that it may be more strategic to figure out who's already in the business to where your intellectual property could be synergistic with an already existing company, because not every invention and not all IP can actually support a whole company.
Thank you. Sorry, another question was coming. Thank you, Bill. And I think, Rob, you also brought up a really interesting point where you may have a disruptive technology where there may not be anyone else in that space, or you may have a technology that may not necessarily be a need as of right now. But I think it's important to recognize the impact that it could have, even if it's in the future. So those are really great points. And Bill, you've been very successful at your own venture. So I think, your points there were very valid as well.
I might add just one more thing, which is, and I think the other panelists are maybe speaking from a primarily healthcare perspective. I think the area that you're looking at, the timelines could be really different. And I think that the requirements could be really different. So again, if you're looking at, things that kind of you read about in the newspapers outside of healthcare that VCs are investing in, whether that's e-commerce or, software hardware, I think that the requirements could be, vastly varying from knowing what the market is, right? A lot of these great hits that you see today didn't quite know what their market was. Might have been a couple of guys that wanted to work together. So I always say that the rule is outside of healthcare and some other very specialized industries, there are no rules. So it may not be too early for you to start a company with two guys, an idea, a business plan, So I think we just need to be careful about just qualifying that we're very specifically talking about very specialized areas such as healthcare.
Thank you, Sarayu, for addressing that. I think making that differentiation is important to not only recognize the fields in which you're operating, but also the technology and what exact area it serves. So I know we only have about a minute left. We weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but I just wanted to ask the panelists if you could provide or share one resource or just advice to those who are interested in, taking their invention or innovation further. What would that be? So Sarayu, if you can sum it up in a sentence, great. But what piece of advice would you give, or resource can you provide?
Sure. I would just say to really just do your due diligence. Venture capitalists do on the other side, but you have the internet, which is such a powerful tool, and you can find almost the answer to anything, and people that would be willing to speak to you. So I would say really put in the time to understand who it is that you want to approach if you're looking for funding and why they fit, and have your story straight. That would, I think, be sort of my most important piece of advice in approaching funders, rather than kind of closing your eyes and just shooting your business plan or what have you out to, dozens of investors where it may not be relevant.
Thank you. And I do want to bring this point up. Someone from the audience did ask, is there the wrong type of funding? So to your point, with not just sending your, your pitch deck to just anyone and everyone, do you believe that there is a wrong type of funder or wrong funding that you could receive from your perspective, Sarayu?
I think doing a deal, it's like a marriage. This person is going to be on your board. And you're probably going to see some tough times together. So I think a lot of times, especially in VC, personal interaction is so important. And a lot of the entrepreneurs that I've invested in, some of who have failed, I'm willing to go put more money back into them, because I'm like, I know that guy failed not because of his capability, but because something happened in the market, what have you. So I think in terms of, you can take, it really sort of depends on what you're looking for out of the relationship. But I think for the most part, you need to be looking for somebody that can work with you. I think it's a marriage. So you want to make sure that you can work with this person, and it's somebody that you want to be with if the ship goes down, that you'd say, you know what, I want that guy in the foxhole with me.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to add either a resource or a tip that you would like to share with the group?
Yeah, one quick comment, and it really tags right onto Sarayu's comment, and that's on due diligence. And I would say for the academics, get out of your office and lab, go around to the city you're in, wherever it is, and meet the CEOs of companies and COOs of companies, because I have learned so much, and I've made a lot of good friends, personal friends, that are CEOs, COOs of companies. And I just think it's an invaluable, and it's free. All it takes is you making the introduction and making yourself available. That's been an enormous help.
Yeah. And the worst that can happen is they say, no, I don't want to take anything.
Right.
Right. Can I add just one more thing, Jade? I think in your T&I journal, we're going to have an article about what are the best ways that you can position actually government and academic innovation to attract private capital. So that's going to be coming up in one of your journal.
Yes, thank you for that advertisement. Jody is sharing resources. So the issue that Sarayu is referring to is Seeding the Future, which will be coming out next quarter. So Rob, I know we're a little over time, and I appreciate everyone who's bearing with us, but do you have any tips or advice that you would like to share quickly?
Just very quickly, I'd say number one thing is, especially in your role in the company, I think the interpersonal trust is critically important in any venture, especially these. Being able to hang together when things become uncertain is critically important. And the role that the inventor will bring is one of absolute objectivity and clearly self-critical approaches, not only to their own thoughts, but also to the direction of the company. I mean, shared privately, of course, within the company, but never get to a position where nature is forced to lower your self-esteem naturally. Never overstate the technology. Be very clear on the risks, be very clear on the advantages, but try to remain, I think, very, very analytical. Never get so close to a strong personal opinion that if that opinion goes down, you have to go down with it. Okay. Yeah. So I think those are good advice to people that kind of are the inventor in these emerging teams to commercialize innovation.
Thank you, Rob. And I could use that that quote in everyday life. Then, so it's not just for the inventor. I think that's important to kind of carry throughout your life, is not taking the opinions to heart in a sense. But I want to, again, thank you all for your time today. It was a very lively discussion, and I know we could go on for hours on this topic, but I do want to mention that this will be recorded and available for future watch on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. So if you are interested in rewatching, or if you want to reach out to us for additional resources, please consider contacting myself or NAI for that matter. So thank you again, and we'll reconvene afterwards. So panelists, just stay on, but I want to thank the audience for attending. So have a wonderful afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you again on behalf of NAI.